Hello and welcome to Simon Says Artwork. In this video I'm going to be discussing a self-portrait that I'm doing, but not from a mirror. It was me sitting still on video for about 3 minutes, and I take a still image of that and I draw that in ink using a Waterman's fountain pen, and yeah, I'll show you how it goes. Let's take a look. So here's me unboxing my Waterman's fountain pen with a set of 8 intense black ink cartridges, and I'm just taking a look at the chamber now, and the nib is nice and clean, and it's a sleek, simple design, but it's quite stylish and professional looking, one which you could have in an office, but I'm obviously just hoping to use it for some more scratchy, nice intense dark ink drawings. It's a nice long cartridge, you know, as opposed to the ones that I remembered from school. We used to have fountain pens when I was in high school, and they'd be very short compared to this. You have to give it a good push into the chamber in order to puncture the end of the cartridge, but once you do, you have a good amount of ink to use so that you're not having to replace it all the time. And then here we go, I get started straight away, and this is going to be just based off a still image from the modeling which I did on a previous video, which I will link here, where I sit still without moving or blinking for about 3.5 minutes. And that's something that I did for university for a second year project. I apologize for all the focus issues that you can see where it's going in and out of focus so often. I don't think I had it set. I don't know if I often do, but it might have been the lighting at the time. Now, with me just using this for the first time, I'm, not fully aware of how narrow or broad the nib is. So how much you can get away with, I suppose. With certain pens, you can really get away with making mistakes, and because the nib is so fine, you can sort of hide the errors by going back over it again and again. Whereas with this, I'm trying to be a bit more sparing with where I make the marks, so that I can really intensify the darker areas and try to leave out everything else to get a good impression of what I look like in the video. The most difficult part of this drawing is because it's the camera is set very low. I don't think it's on the ground, but it could have been. It was either on the ground or it was on a box or something, where I had it set really low down, and it was looking up at me from me sat on a chair and leaning back in the chair against the wall. And that was for a more interesting perspective while I was sitting there. I tried it from a couple of different angles, and it helped me to prepare to not put so much pressure on the moment when I sat down and had to sit still and just stare at a spot on the wall. And when I finally did get comfortable and thought, I'm sticking with this one for as long as I can, it was when the camera was quite low down. I think it was the third attempt. It may have been the second, but I think it was the third. So the hardest part of this drawing, as I was saying, is because the camera is so low down, everything becomes foreshortened, and my head is the smallest part of the picture, kind of like Hassan Piker, if you know who that is, where his head's the smallest part of him. And everything else is getting larger and larger and more magnified towards the camera because it's foreshortened that way. It made it difficult to draw because it feels really unnatural to make your hands or your legs that large unless you're doing a drawing from imagination where you're, looking up at someone from the ground, and then you can really exaggerate it so that it's for almost an action shot. Whereas this wasn't. This was supposed to be more contemplative, and it just made it something where I wasn't sure if it was going to work out. I didn't know if I'd get it, and this was, for a first attempt, I was quite relieved that it worked out the way it did. Now, so far you can't really tell, but the more that I draw, the more that you can see just how dramatic the angle becomes. It's also not very often that I draw on white paper. That may have been something which I did just because it's a fountain pen and it feels more suitable to draw on white paper or to draw on paper. Ordinarily, I draw on bits of cardboard. I just find it much more easy to open up a box, grab a fine liner or a brush pen, and to use it on a piece of cardboard. That's because it's, well, there's several reasons. I'm going to do a video about why I draw on cardboard, but it's just something which I got in the habit of doing where I would hardly ever draw on paper, and it made the prospect of having a sketchbook or a piece of cartridge paper or something where it would be specifically for a piece of art. It would have all this pressure attached to it, which is the worst thing that can happen because it's almost guaranteeing that a drawing won't work out well if you start to become really precious over it. Whereas when I drew on cardboard, it just wouldn't have that pressure. You can see from this part of the drawing how large I'm having to make things already. It just becomes these huge abstract shapes where you may as well just not see them as hands or limbs or any kind of extremities, and it's just shapes that you're drawing, because otherwise it's just something you really have to detach from. It doesn't feel natural at all to draw things like hands or legs that large. It was an unusual time in my life doing this modelling, and that hasn't necessarily subsided now. I've not fallen into a comfortable rhythm with art making, and I blame the course, well, I blame the school that I'm in. It's really made all of the process of art making and the thought process and the development really tricky. Not because of how complicated or tricky fine art is, but because of how the school operates. It's hard when you don't trust or feel supported by tutors. It's hard to open up and make yourself vulnerable with work or with ideas or with resources or anything at all. And they're asking for all of these things. They want to know where you go to websites for resources. They want to know who you work with, what groups you're a part of. And I'm not interested in sharing any of that with them, because of my experience with them has been so bad that I'd just rather them not know. And I do become quite private like that. That's happened before in my life, but it's unfortunate now because it's affecting my, grades, and it's not doing me any good having that reaction. So it's doing a disservice to my potential, but there's not much I can do about that. It's just a reaction I'm having to how they've approached certain students. And I'm one of those students who is less favoured than others and sort of resent the way that they have this huge disparity between some approaches and ones which are pandering to theirs. And I can't pander to tutors either. I've tried and it just felt so obvious, and yet it did yield the results that I thought. If you pander to them, they'll give you better reactions and results. But it feels cheap, it feels easy, and it's not what I'm interested in. But I still do feel as though I have a place in fine arts, just not through this school. I don't really know how to reconcile that, because I don't have an education outside of this school, and yet I've not got any expectation or faith in their judgment or their guidance with what I should or could do. I'm just going to have to figure it out, because there seems to be a gap between what is considered fine art and what's seen as illustration. And what I do a lot of is what's seen as illustration. But to me, it's documenting my vantage point during the pandemic. So the pandemic happened when I started my second year of university. And I'd say that actually we started the second year in late September, and we locked down, or I at least locked down, in early to mid-March. So it wasn't the start, it was just getting to the middle of the second year, and the course was delivered online. That's where I am at the moment in this picture, is isolated, my hair's growing, and I'm experimenting with performance art, which is why I'm sat still for the camera. And I think it's something which I'm going to revisit for the third year, which I'm in now. The thinking behind that is that the painting side of my coursework has become really impractical. With me working from home and isolating in one room, it's my bedroom, and the majority of my bedroom is my bed and my desk. There's little room for large surfaces to paint on, and I could paint on small things, but it's still, painting it's tricky when you're in lockdown like this. So they've advised me to go to video, and that's probably not bad advice. And it is a bit heartbreaking, because I'd like to be a painter. I'd like to do more painting. I do a lot of drawing, and I feel like it's the same language. It's just perhaps, I don't know, slightly different pronunciation of certain aspects of the language that I would have liked to familiarise myself with, but it's just not the same philosophy that I was looking for in the school. So, and I've seen for a lot of people in this country have got the same philosophy, which doesn't really speak to me. I'd prefer a lot more of the Russian and Polish philosophy of fine art schooling and academic study. But there we are, that's something I'm going to have to pursue separately. Because at the moment I have this loose, what would you call it? I suppose just untrained approach to a lot of these things like drawing and painting, and trying to use intuition and observation, which are good things, but they're not enough, in my opinion, to really excel to the point where I'd like to be. I don't mean to be so down, but it is a real difficult point in my life which I'm drawing. I was thinking of trying to express my position, hoping that the world would respond to the pandemic one way, and it didn't. It responded in the other. And I don't know how much of the world I was hearing. feel as though I was only hearing the side of the world that was unwilling to lock down, unwilling to isolate, and to persevere in order to rid ourselves of the virus. And so what I was left with was this feeling of being quite alone. I was quite happy to lock down and isolate in order to avoid infection. And yeah, it's not been the popular approach. And that's what this point of the modelling was me in the midst of a lockdown. Other people were in the studio and other people got infected. And, with me not being in attendance, I had to hear it from people who were attending the studio and were being affected by what was happening there. But it was delivered online as videos, and I don't think they liked the fact that someone like myself would point out where they were not following COVID guidelines, trying to encourage them to be more careful and make sure that people weren't taking unnecessary risks, and that wasn't something they wanted to hear. And luckily for them, they were given the opportunity to stop providing videos, and that's where we are now, where as a remote student, I'm not really being catered for very well. And partway through trying to resolve that, really. It's a lot of hatching that takes up drawings like this, because I am wearing a black suit, and I did try to make an effort to dress up every day because I didn't want to wear pajamas all day. I wanted to change my clothes. I wanted to have a day. I wanted to wake up and do things and feel productive. And I've managed to maintain that. That's not something where I felt comfortable being in my pajamas. I mean, maybe it's because it's quite cold in the house. That could be one thing. But it's also, I think it gets you down. It's a mentality. So what I'm wearing is a suit jacket and some relatively smart trousers and some not dress shoes, but shoes which are as fancy as I have. I'm not one for the finest clothes, but I do try to have something which I'm comfortable in and I feel is relatively smart. And that's what I'm wearing in this still image in the video. It's hard, to try and think about how to communicate an emotion or a state of mind in a performance video, and whether or not you're actually happy doing that, whether it's just embarrassing and not really your thing, which was my feeling. But you have to try to give things a go, because you never know what's going to strike a chord with you and make you, spin off on a direction in art making which you wouldn't have considered. So I did try things like this. I've tried little bits of sculpture, but not much, just bits where I could. Not really had the opportunity to use any resources in the school for the majority of the time I've been there, which is a shame. I would have liked to have used clay and done some sort of ceramics, but that's not happened. I would have liked to have made use of the photography studio which they have there, but that didn't happen. Other people have, but to be honest, if the pandemic ended today, I don't think I'd go back, just because of other problems that have happened at the school, where it's really, heartbreaking to see how much we've lost from when we first attended as first years. The people in my studio were just really nice and kind of comrades in this, journey of trying to make art and to learn this real personal expression of creativity. And I feel like a lot of that has been eroded, but there we are. And then people get into groups and cliques, and it's very similar to high school, and I'm too old for that type of thing. So I had no patience for it. But there we are. That's just how I approached it. Now, the hatching may look a bit chaotic, but I think it is tied together, as far as if you try to honour certain aspects of what you see, it sort of unifies through its reflection of the truth in the image, which is just to say the direction of the curves, of the creases, the folds, and of the depth of the shadow was something which I tried to honour in the rendering which I did in the fountain pen. I do really like how the ink is nice and black. It is an intense black. I like the lines that it makes. It's fun to draw with. It's something which I can use quite easily when I have an idea that I'm relatively confident I can play with. There are some drawings which I've struggled with. I tried to do a drawing recently with this fountain pen and I hadn't thought of the idea first. It's not that I have to visualize it or picture it. It's just that I suppose I have to just give it some thought before I start it. Because if there isn't any reference, you have to have a thought about what you're trying to achieve. Because I can't picture anything clearly in my mind. I think that's an aphantasia which I may have. So instead, I have to think about an idea. And I hadn't done that. So I recently struggled on a drawing with this fountain pen, but it's still fun to draw with. I think it doesn't help that I have a pressure to try and film it every time, and I don't have the best equipment. But for this drawing, my first drawing with it, it was enjoyable because of trying to avoid certain areas in order to retain the whiteness of the paper and to cover other areas with hatching, which I enjoy, but it doesn't always serve the image. Sometimes it's a better drawing if I would have left it much earlier, but I rarely do that. I think I like going too far just because I'm not aware of what too far is, and I'm happy to continue putting little dashes and dots just to see what works. I'm hoping that at some point I'll strike a balance where I'm more aware of what has worked, but I'm not sure how much I've done that. I think at this point I assume that I'm done, and I have a look at it for a moment, and it only takes me a moment to realise that as much as I like the empty shape of the hands, I think it's the line for the index finger on my left hand, which is the one on the right, where I realised that I would like to put more work into the hands and the fingers. It usually exposes how little confidence you have in drawing hands if you leave them like that. And I'd rather not keep that lack of confidence. So the more often you draw hands, the more familiarised you are. I do bring out this nice fat marker, which I've used. I say fat marker, it's not really, is it, very fat? It's just compared to the pens that I usually have. This is nice thick black marks and areas that I can just block out, and that is something which I do enjoy, is juxtaposing a small nib with a kind of scratchy effect for the majority of a drawing. To have that with a marker pen is something which I have enjoyed doing before, and I should do more of, but I never do. I never pair up two pens. I think I assume that there's some sort of merit to having a drawing completed with one pen, and there really isn't. Nobody is more impressed that you've done something with one pen. Doesn't really serve the drawing if you do, necessarily. So for this one, I'm glad that I brought out the marker, just because blocking out shapes is nice. As much as I like the lines behind me, it's nice to have black shapes to balance out the dark areas of the page, because otherwise it does just reduce into nothing or call for more hatching. So at this point, I make a decision to go back in, start working the hands again, because that's what it requires. It's just something which I couldn't leave alone. I'm happy with how it looks. It does look cool to me, but I'd be happier if I fill in that space with the hands. As much as it's nice having that white space in the center of the image, it would just bother me. So I go back in here and I fix that. I think the things behind me, the coat on the chair and whatever it is, I think it may just be canvases that are stacked to the left, to the right, but it's to the left of me in the picture, but it's on the right hand side of the picture. I think I'm happy with that as just lines. That doesn't really hurt. But for things like the hands, it's just too much of a center focal point of the image. So this is where I have to commit to tackling the different complexities of the fingers interlocked on my knee. And I'm glad that I do. It's something which I'm still grappling with, hands and fingers. I think I'd probably do a better job from imagination than I would from reference a lot of the time. That depends, I suppose, but it's hit and miss all the time, I suppose. But I think it really improves a drawing, or just any art, when it's a person and you can see the fingers and the hands, because they are expressive and gestural, and that's something which, if you hide them, it's hidden that potential of expressing something with the hands. And if I were to have left them as spaces, it may have looked nicer, but I quite like the fact that I committed to putting them in, because it expresses the fingers being interlocked on my knee, and it just serves the drawing to me. But it is a case of judging, where does the finger poke out? It becomes very abstract again, because they're all quite large and floating in the middle of this empty space. It all feels a bit wrong and a bit messy, but if you just commit and remember that, if you trust the process of just honouring what you're seeing in the reference, then it will come together. And if you get it wrong, then you've got the opportunity to not show anyone and to reflect on what you've got wrong, to not take it to heart, and to make sure that the next time you try it, you go for it again. Whether you get it wrong or not, just go for it again and try to correct what you got wrong last time. And even if you don't, at least you're trying. Just continue to try. So that's what I did, and I feel better about it, if I'm being honest. I do feel better about certain drawings over ones which I did years ago. I just think that they've got more experience. The experience of just pausing for a moment and just making sure that I've seen something correctly. I was told once, if you go to a life drawing class and you're given 10 minutes to draw a pose, use 5 of those 10 minutes just looking, without drawing anything. And I've done that. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it is really good advice. It's not easy, because you know that you've only got 10 minutes. And 10 minutes is nothing. But if you do spend 5 of those 10 minutes looking, really looking at the model, really looking at what you need to draw and to understand, your drawing is much more well informed, because you've spent that extra time, than it would have been if you'd have just dived straight into it, trying to figure it out on the fly, which I've done both. And I do think it's wise to at least try once in your life to spend half of the time not drawing, just observing, and see what happens. It's interesting. It's a different mindset, and it's very much an old-fashioned artistic approach, in my opinion. It's something which we've not been told in university. People don't know these things, but I'd like to share things which I've learnt, and one of them is that in a life drawing session, use half of the time allotted just looking at the model, just analysing all of the angles, all of the intersecting lines, all of the measurements that will be making and will be trying to render. Lines that go from the chin down to the crook of the knee, or from the elbow to the feet. Whatever lines up, whatever diagonals or horizontals or verticals you can see matching, do all of that without drawing and see what happens. In my experience, your drawing it's just an appreciation that you wouldn't have had without it. It just feels different, feels better. Now, I didn't do that for this drawing. It perhaps would have served me better to have looked at the image of myself and made those measurements, but I was quite excited to use the pen, and I think I got away with it with this. I think it's got some interesting marks. And the thing about messy hatching is that you can go back on top of it and hatch on top, and so long as you've got the ability to make halftone into shadow, or the range of darker halftone from lighter halftone or midtone, then you have the wiggle room to fix certain things that aren't broken but are a little bit more rough than you'd like them to be. So that's what some of this is. It's just me going in and cross-hatching over hatching, just to darken some parts. And as usual, whenever I think I'm finished, I put the pen down, I try to assess what I've done, and it doesn't take too long until I realise that there is always a little bit more that you could do, just another touch before you're finished. Because as soon as you turn the camera off, you're done. I suppose you could turn the camera back on, but I really struggle to do that. If I've done a drawing and I've spent time doing it, and then I put my pen down, I turn the camera off, usually I'm done. So a lot of this is you seeing me put the cap on, put the pen down, have a look at the drawing, looking back at the photo reference, and then picking the pen back up. But then I'm done. I commit to it. That's it, finished. And it was fun. And I think it's not too bad. It's not a million miles away from what the reference looks like. And it's a time capsule for that period in my life where I was dealing with those things. Alright, so that's the drawing. That's it finished. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please give it a like, and you leave a comment down in the comment section below, and subscribe to the channel and ring that bell so that you get notifications whenever I upload, which currently is between 2 and 3 times a week, and I'll try and keep that pace up, so please support the channel if you can. Alright, see you in the next video.